group of organizations, nonprofits, development organizations, grassroots groups who had been coming together. They started originally as a kind of a cohort of small scale organizations that came together around the COP conferences. There's the new COP, I think COP 30 is happening next week in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. And over the past, especially the last several of these conferences where nations come together to discuss how to address climate change, how are we going to collectively reduce our carbon footprint, reduce carbon emissions, address all of the effects of global climate change. Especially many of these conferences, from the perspective of these organizations, have been kind of co-opted by big business interests, by governments who are dragging their feet, by a number of actors who were not really engaged in trying to make the changes that were necessary. And so now in many of these big international conferences, not just on global climate change, but on biodiversity, on all sorts of other ecological and social issues, you have these kind of alternative conferences where usually a week before or a week after or sometimes parallel to the official conference, there's what's known as kind of these people conferences where different strategies are discussed. And obviously, since these are organizations that are not represented by government bodies, by big business interests, most of what's discussed is maybe symbolic in nature. It's policy proposals, ideas um, that are not binding, of course, not legally binding because no government is signing on to them. But it's a space that's created where people can try to put forth different ideas about how to address some of the major issues. And so during the past, especially the past two COP conferences, these global conferences on climate change, one was held in Azerbaijan and one in Dubai. So two of the biggest fossil fuel producing nations. And a lot of these organizations had these alternative conferences to come up and say, look, obviously, big business interests, big governments are not interested in responding to these issues, and we want to come together and create a alternative source of information. So, out of these last two conferences, a group of organizations came together, and last year they published what was known as the Localism Manifesto, and it's basically a short document that you can find online. There's actually several, there are at least three that I know of, localism manifestos that have been published over the past 10, 20 years. So you might have to search for which one's the correct or which one's the most recent one that I'm going to reference in today's class. But yeah, basically it was a group of organizations that came together and said, look, all of the different ecological, social, health, uh, all of the different myriad crises that we are facing are not being responded to, right? He said, we came together as a group of organizations looking at how we can respond to the issue of global climate change. And what we've seen is despite the fact that we have 30 years of international conferences, these COP conferences, to try and discuss ways to reduce carbon emissions, to meet certain targets, even though we signed agreements in 2015, the Paris Accords were signed. Despite all of these efforts at nation states and big business interests to try to come to terms with how we can react to global climate change, every year more fossil fuels are being extracted and burned. Every year, uh, the global climate change, all of the parameters, all of the statistics are getting worse. This shows, according to these organizations, that something is not working. And instead of putting forth different policies about how we can improve carbon trading schemes or enforce more national pledges on reducing fossil fuels. What the Localism Manifesto actually said is that the problem is one of design of how we are politically and economically designed as a society. And I think that that was kind of a radical statement to say it's not an issue of how do we design better policies to reduce fossil fuel use, to reduce carbon emissions. It's not an issue of how the United Nations can be more effective in implementing these policy proposals. It has nothing to do with that. He said it's the primary fault is one of baseline design, that we are a globalist society. Globalization has rooted itself into our very way of understanding who we are politically, economically, socially, culturally. And the idea behind the Localism Manifesto is that this globalized way of understanding ourselves as a species is one that is failed. It's causing very serious problems. So these organizations came together and they put forward the Localism Manifesto, which is a short document. We're going to towards the second part of the class, I'm going to outline basically four of the principles that they outline, and says that if we're going to address the problems that we're facing, uh, whether it be, big global problems like global climate change, biodiversity loss, et cetera, or even smaller scale problems that are affecting localities, we have to reorient our way of life towards localism. And we're going to define what that means. So basically, the class summary is what is localism? I want to define basically what we mean by that. We've talked about local economy in past classes. We've talked about bioregionalism. All of these are kind of different tenets of the same idea. But basically, the idea is that it is best for ourselves as individuals, for communities, and for localities, and even for nation states to have strong, thriving, rooted communities that do as much as they can to take care of themselves. That has repercussions both on the international, national, personal, familiar level. That when people take charge, take responsibility for their own autonomy, for taking care of themselves, for trying to provide as much as possible for themselves, this has positive, generally tends to have positive repercussions along the spectrum of how society is organized. So I want to talk about that. And then two of the thinkers that I think historically, these are a philosopher and a historian, before the term localism was ever used, or bioregionalism, or whatever term we want to use, Christopher Lasch and Simone Weil, a French and North American historian and a French philosopher, talked very deeply in the mid 20th century about how we were moving away from an idea of rooted local communities. And they were kind of these prophetic voices that saw that there was going to be a lot of negative repercussions as globalism started to expand. So I think that it's worthwhile, before we look exactly at what the Localism Manifesto says, I'd like to quickly look at the historical work of Christopher Lasch and the philosophy of Simone Weil, to see what they had to say as the globalized. Simone Weil was writing in the 1950s, Christopher Lasch mostly in the 1970s. And I think they were very prescient in how they understood how this movement towards globalization was going to unwind. And then lastly, I want to take a look at the four principles of localism that are outlined in the Localism Manifesto that I mentioned. Okay, so let's start with some definitions. What does localism mean? How is it defined by different dictionaries, different groups, different grassroots organizations? One definition is that localism is the belief that services should be controlled and provided, or goods produced and bought within a local area for the benefit of people in that area. I really like this definition because I think it's important to understand that the idea of localization, of strengthening our communities, the places where we live, is not just about goods, right? A lot of the focus, especially in recent years, has been on, relocalizing our economies, right? Right. So producing more of our food, producing energy, especially with renewable energy technologies. There's a movement about localized energy, cooperatives and things like that. Obviously, that's important, right? How can we reorient our economic lives through the things that we use? All of the economic goods that we purchase, that we consume, that we use. All of those goods, if they can be produced and sold and used and recycled locally, they should be. But this definition also mentions services. And I think that's an extremely important thing. One that Ivan Illich, who we've talked about in many classes, was very focused on as well. He said one of the things that globalization has brought is not just the globalization of consumer goods, but also of the service industry, right? Educational curriculum that our children are taught is often completely divorced from any connection to the localities where we live. The social work help that a lot of communities receive, the all of the different service industries also obey this, especially in the last 30, 40, 50 years, this ethic of derootedness, of taking us away from our place, right? Instead of trying to deal with our issues as locally as possible, we look to an expert, right? Ivan Illich was also very fond of critiquing the healthcare industry, right? So whenever, in the past, when somebody got sick, there was a local doctor who would do local house visits that would come to the community and listen to people. And now, whenever we're sick, we automatically send our sick family member or ourselves to a huge medical institution that is often has very, very little connectedness to the local community. Um, so that's one definition of localism, that services and goods that are produced or bought should be done so within the local area for the benefit of people in that area. Localism is also centered on the policy of devolving power from a central or federal government to local bodies. I think it's important to mention that the idea of localism is not just economic in nature. Obviously, there's an important economic component, right, to creating strong, resilient local economies, producing things, having goods circulate as much as possible within a local area. But for that to be possible, especially in a globalized political system where centers of power and wealth, are not local, in order for local economies to really thrive, we're going to also have to understand localism from a political lens, right? How can we strengthen local political bodies, whether it be mayorships, whether it be community councils, whatever that might look like. So localism also has a political component about devolving power from central or federal governments to as local bodies as possible. Localism is defined by a way of acting characteristic of one locality, local customs, practices, or mannerisms. So lastly, I want to say there's an economic component to localism, there's a political component, but there also has to be a corresponding social and cultural embrace of what is unique and characteristic of each place. Another resounding characteristic or aspect of globalization is kind of this homogenous uh, uh, global culture where everybody listens to the same music, we watch the same movies, the same Netflix shows. Our entertainment industry has been taken over by this global conglomerate, where everybody sees the same things. And local nuances of culture are either lost or ignored or overshadowed by this kind of hegemonic global pseudo culture type of thing. So localism is also about valuing what is unique to our places. And sometimes what is unique is something that can be quirky, right? Some of the things that make each space very unique. Instead of kind of shying away from that, really trying to embrace and be proud of what makes our localities unique. And lastly, this is a dictionary definition. When you type in localism to any online dictionary, usually you'll get at least one of the entries as this last one: narrow outlook, provincialism. So there's also historically a negative kind of aspect of localism. People, when we think of what is local, a lot of times we think of a lack of tolerance for difference. We think of customs that can be prejudicial or causing harm to local people, that isn't open to accepting differences. And I wanted to keep that aspect of the definition here so that at the very end, I want to kind of try and respond to that, right? How can we embrace a new form of localism that tries to avoid some of these narrow outlooks, these prejudices, these provincialist attitudes? Um, the Front Porch Republic is one movement in the United States. It's a group of scholars and academics and readers who publish periodically. And they wrote put together a book called Localism in the Mass Age. And in the very introduction to that book, I think they give a fairly good definition of what localism in the modern age entails, right? Not localism as it was 200 years ago, but localism is how can we try to reorient our lives to place in a culture that is firmly rooted in globalist tendencies. And they say, why reorient our lives toward local communities, local economies, farmlands, and forests? Because that's where you can be a citizen rather than a consumer. I think that's very important when we think about what is our primal political identity in the globalization of today's world. Most of us understand ourselves more as consumers than as citizens, right? There's this idea that each dollar is a vote, and that the best way that we can make ourselves politically useful is through, what we buy, how we consume. While there might be some truth to that, um, I don't think that understanding ourselves as consumers really has the ability to replace the political connectedness of a citizen, of a person who is really interested in trying to change and be active, participating in the political and economic and cultural life of their places. Um, so yeah, localities are where you can be a citizen rather than a consumer, where you can see a need and help to meet it, where kinfolk might gather not just to visit, but to live, where flesh and blood neighbors, not online or digital communities, can offer one another aid and companionship, where public officials must answer for their actions, where you can grow food when the trucks stop rolling, where sun and wind offer free energy, and where you can protect and restore a piece of the earth. One of the things I like kind of about that definition is that these aspects of a return to localism, there's a sense of empowerment, right? There's a big difference between being a consumer and being a citizen. There's a big difference between seeing a need and being able to respond and reading on the newspaper about some foreign war, some genocide, some climatic disaster on the other side of the world and not being able to do anything. That's not to say that we shouldn't care about all of the suffering that happens around the world, but there's a huge difference in empowerment about seeing the need of a neighbor and being able to respond, and hearing of a genocide or a hurricane on the other side of the world and really not knowing what else to do, just kind of feeling numbness at this. So this definitionalism, what I think it really gets at is that by returning our lives to a proper scale, to a proper rootedness to place, there is also an aspect of empowerment, of really being able to respond and to do things. As one can see from the diverse definitions, the idea of localism obviously has repercussions for our political, economic, and cultural arrangements, right? We're not just talking about strengthening local businesses. We're not just talking about trying to rescue local traditions. Localism embraces the totality of our economic, political, and cultural lives. It has a way of really reorienting how we live our lives in all different aspects. Modernity, in essence, is the antithesis of localism. The past 100 years of globalization has focused on the globalization of economic goods, the centralization of political power, the outsourcing of local responsibility to institutional and professional management, and the disruption of authentic cultural expressions by the globalization of homogenous forms of desire. I think that's important. Again, modernity has essentially tried to completely erase the positive aspects of localism, right? Through getting rid of local economies, by inserting everybody into this global economic behemoth, by taking away political power from localities and making the central government or even international bodies have much more influence than localities. By having humanity adopt this idea that instead of trying to respond to the needs of ourselves, of our families, of our communities, we should always rely on professionals. That's another form of outsourcing power away from communities, right? The idea that we can no longer teach our children, we need a professional teacher, professional schools to do that. We can no longer uh, heal ourselves when we're sick. We need to depend on a professional for that. This institutionalization of needs is another way of disrupting local autonomy, local economies, and local power. What are some of the key aspects of the localism movement as we see it today? Well, we already talked about one key aspect is the devolution of political power. One core principle of localism, and these five aspects were outlined in the Localism Manifesto. So, in political terms, one core principle of localism is the transfer of authority and responsibility from central government to local bodies and communities, right? Trying to find ways to really make local governance structures much more than just symbolic. Here in El Salvador, where I live, we have local governments, we have small scale municipalities. But during the past 5 or 6 years, what they are really u- used for, what they can really be involved with is essentially, the most minor and symbolic acts of governance, right? They have no political power in terms of making strong decisions. They have very little access to economic resources. The political codes in this country are about taking power away from localities and centralizing it in the state government, right? And localism is about changing that dynamic, right? Not saying let's completely get rid of any sort of nation state model, get rid of federal governments. No, the idea is how can we try to return as much power as possible to localities, to municipalities, to citizen councils, etc. Another aspect is community empowerment, right? So it's not just about investing all of this power in the figure of a mayor or whatever. It's about seeking to empower individuals, local organizations, city councils to take ownership of local issues, find solutions, and actively participate in decision-making processes, right? It's about trying to put power in the hands of grassroots organizations, civil society, etc. It also has, obviously, an economic aspect. It encourages the support of local production and consumption, strengthening local businesses, local suppliers to keep profits and decision-making authority within the community. You can't have strong local governance without a strong local economy. Because obviously, if you have a community that only purchases things from the outside, there's not going to be any circulation of money. There's not going to be any invested economic need within that locality. So the idea of investing local communities with political power rests on a strong local economy. Obviously, promoting local identity. Localism includes fostering a sense of local identity by celebrating our local histories, our cultures, our unique local features, the landscapes, the places, the physical, geographical places where we live. All of these things can strengthen a sense of bond, of coherency within the community where we live. And lastly, citizen participation. It emphasizes the importance of citizens being well informed and involved in local decisions that affect our lives and the areas where we live. Um, One of the things about these kind of five aspects of localism is that if you go back, bueno, 100 years in some places, maybe 50 years in other places, maybe just 10 years in some places, um, localism used to be the primary way of organizing our political, economic, and cultural lives, right? Obviously, there was historic periods where, wealthy people might have enjoyed a bit more of a globalized aspect. But the vast majority of humanity lived localized lives. We purchased things that were made locally, that were grown locally, that were produced locally. We voted in local elections. The vast majority of political decisions were taken locally. But what changed? Why did localism decline? The lives of our parents and grandparents was much more local in nature than the lives of most of us today, right? So what happened? One, I think the fossil fuel era created a sense of power that opened up the world to a far larger part of humanity. For the first time in history, large numbers of people could live like kings and queens. Obviously, not everyone. I'm not saying that all of these benefits of globalization were equally distributed. That's not true. However, there was a very the fossil fuel era allowed a sense of power in terms of energy, in terms of access to resources that was unparalleled throughout history, right? Today, even a lower middle class person has more access to wealth and resources than the pharaoh, in ancient Egypt. All of us, have the opportunity to live lives of extraordinary power that, even that past kings and queens of historical periods, behind us could not have even imagined, right? The allure of being able to eat any type of cuisine on a given night, of being able to order on Amazon or Temu or Alibaba, anything from around the world and have it delivered to our homes in just a few days, of having the world at our fingertips, triumphed over the steadiness of tradition and the repetitiveness of stability, right? It makes sense, for the lives of my grandparents who, ate the same food every day, who saw the same people every day, who are involved in this repetitiveness of tradition. All of a sudden, when the world opened up, when fossil fuels and power and globalization, brought all these new things to our doorstep, it was obvious that there was going to be this kind of infatuation with globalization. Um, Obviously, there were embedded economic interests. There were very wealthy people who wanted to push the globalization agenda. There are also kind of evolutionary tendencies. There's a tendency, human ecologists say that human beings, as a social animal, when we have the ability to expropriate more energetic resources for ourselves, we're going to do that. That's kind of like our evolutionary tendencies, right? It's something that we are born with. So if you combine all of these things, local lives, localism is often abandoned when it can be. And for a brief period in history, over the past 50, 100 years, we've been able to abandon our localities because of this enormous boon of resources, of energy that has been available to us. However, what we often don't talk about are what are some of the unforeseen and negative consequences of this globalization. Christopher Lasch, like I said, he was working as a historian throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He was one of the first people in North America, especially historians, who was able to look at the tendencies of globalization and really critique what was happening. He argued that American culture, and America was kind of this birthplace of the globalization movement, right, had become increasingly addicted to instant gratification, which placed individual desires unmoored by virtue-based cultural norms above the flourishing of the common good. Fundamentally, Lash attributed this cultural rot to the idea of progress, which he explained is couched in the refusal to acknowledge limits to human powers. And ultimately tears people out of familiar contexts and weakens kinship ties, local and regional traditions, and attachments to the soil, right? So all of the tradition of rootedness, of localized lives, of communities that tried to organize their lives as best as possible within a localized context, was uprooted by the instant gratification of globalization, right? Of trying to of having ourselves understand that the sole good or importance of our lives was trying to consume more, progress more, and that kind of tore us out of these steadiness of traditions, right? That had existed for so long. Um, Lash said in his book, Mass Culture Reconsidered, capitalism itself, thanks to its growing dependence on consumerism, promotes an ethic of hedonism and health and thus undermines the traditional values of thrift and self-denial. These ideals that came out of rootedness, of localism, that we need to try and think not only about what's good for ourselves, but what's good for our community, was kind of uprooted when globalization said you can have anything you want. If you work hard, if you insert yourself into this global economy, then infinite progress is made available to you. One of the most well-known works of Lash is called culture of narcissism. And in this book, he criticizes this meritocratic class, a group of people who achieve success through upward mobility, through education, that increasingly came to be defined by rootlessness, cosmopolitanism, a thin sense of obligation, and diminishing reservoirs of patriotism. And he argued that this new class retained many of the vices of traditional aristocracy without its virtues, lacking the sense of reciprocal obligation that had been a feature of the old order. Said all of a sudden everybody is kings, but at least in the past, a good king or a good queen would say, "Well, I have a responsibility to behave nobly towards my subjects." And what Lash says is that in the culture of narcissism, in globalized economic capitalism, everybody wants to have the things of kings and queens, but nobody wants the responsibility towards a place, towards a nation, towards a community. Globalization, according to Lash, has turned elites into tourists in their own countries. The digitalization of society tends to produce a class who see themselves as world citizens, but without accepting any of the obligations that citizenship in a polity normally implies, right? We no longer belong to a place. We say that we belong to a global village, but nobody cares about the global village. Nobody does anything to really try and respond to the global problems because they're too large, they're too complex, they're beyond our abilities. So, by inserting ourselves, our political, cultural, and economic lives into this globalization machine, we've also removed ourselves from any sense of responsibility towards taking care of this, right? This withdrawal from the common life of a place was seen as the surest sign of upward mobility. It was also, however, the first sign of mental health issues, the loneliness epidemic, the loss of deeper purpose and feelings of belonging. So, what we start to see is as we reorient our lives towards a globalized idea of self and away from a rooted, localized view of self, we also see a deterioration of what it means to be a healthy human being. Before Lash, about 20 years before he was writing, Simone Weil wrote a book called The Need for Roots, which was diagnosing the causes of the social, cultural, and spiritual malaise that was afflicting around the 1950s. And she was from France and Europe, but she was looking at this from a Western perspective. Val believed that any healthy society requires a web of social relations where no one must violate an obligation to fulfill another obligation, right? Where no one should damage the local community uh, in search of greater upward mobility, in search of economic progress, etc. Vale examines what she calls uprootedness, defined as a near universal condition in modernity resulting from the destruction of ties with the past and the dissolution of community. She specifies the requirements that must be met so that peoples can once again feel rooted in a cultural and spiritual sense to their environment, to their labor, and to both the past and to the expectations for the future. Her book called The Need for Roots is a wonderful read. She says that human beings have roots by virtue of their real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape particular treasures of the past and particular expectations for the future. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. Right. So during the era of globalization, we talk about the rights of consumers, the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to this, the right to that, upward mobility. But she says, well, in our search for all of these things, for increasing individual access to all of the spoils of modernity, we forgot the most important yet least recognized need. Our need for roots, our need for belonging to a place, our need for feeling a sense of possibility to be active, to have our voices heard, to participate in the political, cultural, and economic lives of the places where we live. Today, however, rapidly we are beginning to approach the limits of this experiment in globalization. This is my thesis. Maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe globalization is just beginning. Maybe we're on the cusp of something much larger. However, I think that some of the writing is on the wall. We're already seeing an enormous diminishment of returns on energy, on mining, etc. Globalization has erased the bounty of the earth. And I think we're going to be pushing up against the natural limits of what globalization can provide. At the same time, we see all of the psychological effects of globalization. When you no longer feel belonging, no longer feel roots, no longer feel a sense of autonomy and empowerment, you see a profound boredom with the consumer lifestyle. You see people turning to all sorts of different drugs and alcohol and the depression epidemic, right? And even now, in the popular imagination, we no longer talk about globalizing the world because we've already done that. Now we have to talk about colonizing Mars. There was an article today where Google said they're going to be sending their data centers to outer space. This idea that the Earth is no longer enough for our dreams. A return to rootedness, I think, is in the making, but not a return to some idyllic past, but to a localism grounded in the possibilities unleashed by our experiment in globalization. In today's world, when we talk about localism or about a relocalization, we're not talking about just returning to how our grandparents or great grandparents or how our ancestors lived, right? All of us have been affected by globalization. The fact that we're all speaking here on a technology like the internet, like Zoom, speaks to this reality. Kwame Appiah is one person who's kind of thought about this, and he coined a term called rooted cosmopolitanism. Rooted cosmopolitanism, right? So this idea that you can, at the same time, have roots and be open to the world, right? That you can respect your locality and also find value in all of the vastness that has been opened up to the world through the internets, through economic globalization, etc. Appiah says a rooted cosmopolitan understands the value of community and what he acquires from membership in a community. Consequently, he expands his own understanding of self-interest to include preservation of that community from which he takes those benefits. This is the sense in which he is rooted. He is cosmopolitan in recognizing the globe as one of the communities to which he belongs, not the only one, but one of which, and making the preservation of that global community a matter of self-interest. Importantly, and even paradoxically, preserving that global community requires responsiveness to the particular local interests of the other members of the global community, right? So this idea that we can return to our roots, return to local places without necessarily abandoning or turning our back on the world, right? Localism does not necessarily mean that I only care about this tiny little place in this corner of a mountain of El Salvador where I live. No, I can care about what's happening in Africa, what's happening in South America. I can be globally informed, but my interaction with the global community depends ultimately on my participation, my livelihood in a specific place, right? How I'm going to respond and do my part to affect the fight against global climate change is about how I respect the ecological resiliency of the place where I live. Real quickly, before we run out of time, I want to try and look at the four principles of localism. We've already alluded to these throughout, but the Localism Manifesto outlines four principles of localism. And one other thing, again, that I think I find interesting about this is that the four principles that are outlined in this Localism Manifesto, two of them, the third and the fourth, talk about this idea of rooted cosmopolitanism, right? That we can have roots and time be open to the world. So the first principle is the imperative of action, right? Localism means that if we discover a problem in our backyard, we address it immediately and locally. We don't wait for permission, assistance, or money from higher levels of government, from NGOs, from nonprofit organizations, and we don't waste time pointing fingers at others. Localists are fundamentally solutions oriented. This idea that really belonging to a place in reclaiming an autonomy over our lives allows us to not outsource responsibility, right? If we see a problem in our community, we need to act, right? And one of the things that I think the era of globalization has opened up is kind of a malaise or a laziness in terms of ethics, right? If we see a problem, we want to point fingers. We want to elect the right official. We want to vote in the next election. But localism says you can do all of those things, but you should also act. You should also come together with your community and find ways to really respond to the issues at hand. In terms of the governance of localism, localism believes a lot in political subsidiarity. That subsidiarity means that a problem should be solved at the most immediate level possible, the lowest, smallest, or least centralized authority capable of solving it. If a problem can be solved locally, it should be. Localists insist that the power be held primarily at the local level, with states, nation states, holding less power, countries less still, and global institutions the least amount. By power, we mean the power collectively to tax, regulate, and administer projects. Political scientists call this structure subsidiarity. The logic of localism suggests that local governments in most countries should have significantly stronger powers of taxation, regulation, and spending than they have today, right? Trying to say that it's not to say that the United Nations or that nation state governments should cease to exist, but that they should only be involved in those aspects that are critically required for international forms of governance. If something can be addressed at a local level, it should be. Only when there is a strong consensus that power must be exerted at a higher level, perhaps because local solutions are unworkable, unfair, or inefficient, should power move up. Absent a good reason to go higher, the presumption is always that power should remain local, right? Another principle of localism is the idea of partnership. This is an idea, again, that localism does not mean enclosing ourselves within our community, building walls or fortresses around our little sacred place and not interacting with anybody. No, localism does not necessarily mean going it alone. It can also mean finding partners to serve local needs. Sometimes that's higher levels of government, the region or the state, but increasingly it's other communities around the world struggling with similar challenges. Responsible localists look everywhere for solutions and insights. One interesting kind of aspect of that, when I was living in Guatemala, there was a lack of access to electricity in the vast majority of the rural communities. And the communities came together and said, we want to, increase our access to electricity. We want our communities to have electricity. But they didn't go to the Guatemalan government or the state government and say, when are you going to bring us electricity? When you're going to, send the power lines our way? What they did actually is, together with some organizations, they contacted a group of rural communities in India. And they actually sent a small group of their community members to India to learn about micro hydro projects. And the idea was that, this particular part of Guatemala had an enormous amount of rivers. And they wanted to learn how they could create their own electricity using micro hydropower plants. So they went to India, they learned from this other community, they brought back the technologies, and now 4 of these rural communities have their own autonomous electricity plants. That was kind of this aspect of opening up to the rest of the world, learning about micro hydropower from small indigenous communities on the other side of the world. The connectivity of the internet age makes this possibility much more attractive and far-reaching today. However, it also requires the ability to not let the abundance of information or connection sever the real ties to concrete places, right? Developing partnerships and communities online should always be to try and nurture and strengthen the real flesh and blood communities where we live, right? The idea is not that we're all going to, create these little online fortresses where we have our identities, but no, that the information age can open up abilities for local communities to be more connected in service of strengthening their local economies, their local cultures, etc. And lastly, this idea of tolerance, right? Again, this is kind of responding to that first definition that some dictionaries define localism as parochialism, as closed-mindedness, as prejudice-based places, right? But the Localism Manifesto ends by saying that tolerance is important. Localism means live and let live. Localists appreciate that every community is different with different values, ideas, and traditions. When appropriately empowered, every community will make different choices, right? There is no universal one correct way to do things. When appropriately empowered, in a world where your community is allowed to move closer to its ideals, other communities may choose to move further away. A localist world is one where we learn to tolerate choices made by other communities we despise, as long as they respect basic human rights, right? Understand that our way is not the only way, and that another community might choose to do things different, and that that's okay, right? Fighting the tendency to move towards parochialism through the idea of rooted cosmopolitanism, right? This idea that there are basic human dignities and rights that should be respected, but how those are manifested allows for different ways of understanding things. Um, and lastly, I'm going to end with a quote from Wendell Berry. He is one who has been firmly on the side of strengthening local communities, etc. And he says that the principles of neighborhood and subsistence will often be disparaged by the globalists as protectionism. And that is exactly what it is, right? It is a protectionism that is just and sound because it protects local producers and is the best assurance of adequate suppliers to local consumers. In the idea that local needs should be met first and only surpluses exported does not imply any prejudice against charity towards people in other places or trade with them. The principle of neighborhood at home always implies the principle of charity abroad. And the principle of subsistence is, in fact, the best guarantee of givable or marketable surpluses. This kind of protection is not isolationism. I think he's making an economic argument, right? That localism is not necessarily the same as isolationism. It's that if I can be a good neighbor to my people, that means that I can be also a good global citizen. And I think that's a good one to end on. So I'll go ahead and leave it there and open it up to questions, comments.